Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk ETC. I have a guest with me, Zane Starr from ETC Labs, and he's going to share a little bit of what he's doing there and what it's like to work for ETC Labs. And we, of course, thank ETC Labs for all they do, all the development work and other initiatives that they support that support Ethereum Classic. So welcome, Zane.
Thank you, Christian. Excited to be here and just sort of talk about what's going on.
Yeah. So how long have you been working with ETC Labs?
So I want to say I've been working for ETC Labs for maybe about 4 months, 3 or 4 months. I'm like one of the latest additions to the team.
Okay. And so before that, well, I tell you what, why don't you give the story? Like, tell what we did before. Yeah. Let's
So I'll try and make this brief, but I'll also take you on a little bit of a journey. So, all right. I originally went to school for electrical and computer engineering. I did that and dabbled in some wireless sensor network research and found my way, of course, inevitably towards working on financial software. Out of college, I joined a software finance firm and started studying for the CFA. And then the market.
Why was that inevitable? You said you started with electrical engineering?
Well, yeah. So
why would it be inevitable to go into finance?
It was kind of a funny joke back then. So I think the year was maybe 2007. Yeah.
Okay.
So it was around like that time in which the financial market was really booming.
Right.
And so there are lots of jobs and lots of money to be made right out of college, like working in the sort of finance sector and finance realm. And so that was kind of like a hot topic where a lot of good and talented engineering students would be like, oh, well, you could do engineering, but you could do engineering for this finance firm, or
sure,
you could write this kind of software. Financial software is fintech was kind of just like starting to explode. Yep.
All right. Well, and so you got into fintech, and then the market crashed. So then what happened? Were you able to stay at your job and still do interesting fintech stuff, or?
Well, it was more like tangential to that. So it's like building technology to help people do returns analysis and things like that. And so I still had my job. My particular sector was not downturned, but it did make me sort of question. So I was taking the CFA exams. I passed my level 1. Then I just took my level 2.
What's CFA?
Chartered Financial Analyst.
Okay.
So it's like a professional designation, kind of like a CPA.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, it's for financial investments.
So is fintech still hot? And did people regret going into it after the crash in 2008? Or
I don't think that anyone has really regretted it. But I would say, like, I was living in New York at the time, and so it was just like, all my friends were losing their jobs. The market looked really bleak.
Right.
And so, like, the people are still like there, very happy, and the market turned around and things like that. So that was good. But really, it made me like sort of question what I wanted to be doing.
Right. You can't just follow, if you just follow fads, right? And then the fads, what's trendy changes. You don't want to get stuck in. Yeah, good point.
And then the other thing is like, how interested was I in finance, or like where did I want to be? And I kind of thought maybe a long-term play was to be a VC. And so I just like really looked inside myself and was like, well, what I really want to be doing is developing cool tech and working for startups. So I moved out of that sector and joined a startup called Hyperpublic, and like worked on that for a year before we were acquired. From there, I went to work for Groupon, and then sort of moved out to the West Coast and San Francisco. And yeah.
Okay, so you were involved in various tech startups, You had a fintech background, electrical engineering training. So, what was the move like, or what caused you to drift into blockchain
Oh,
technologies?
yeah. So I ended up tangentially working on some other startups that started touching on this idea of decentralization. And so I ended up working on these sort of distributed data type system based systems. And then I started working for a startup called Attic Labs that was working on a decentralized database to try and be sort of get for data. And so these sort of technologies started nudging me in this direction. And then a few years ago, a friend of mine was like, "Oh, what do you think about this blockchain stuff?" And I was like, "Oh, well, blockchain seems cool. Actually, this seems very similar to a lot of the things I've been kind of like dabbling in on the side." And so I kind of took a deep dive into it and ended up working for Consensus.
Oh, that's a nice
Working on,
company.
yeah, right?
Well, you
Good
work
place
for
to
all the
transition
cool. You get all the cool opportunities. So,
to.
okay, okay,
So I ended up working for Consensus on the project called Solarius, which was to sort of create this decentralized science fiction universe. And so from there, I just started taking a deeper dive into decentralized technology, how we can use blockchain to sort of manage these shared assets, and looking at things like economic token models, and like really building like infrastructure. So again, I kind of hit another like transition period. The decentralized science fiction project was a very speculative project, and so when the market turned for Ethereum, the project itself was turned down for its next round of funding
okay.
and backing. So from there, I started playing around with state channels and like hacking on different technology, as I had already been doing in the background, and ended up starting to work for ETC Labs and start working on this OpenRPC project.
Okay.
And
So
so,
you weren't one of the ones that came in. You weren't one of the developers that came into ETC Labs via formerly from ETC Dev.
no, not formally from ETC Dev.
Right.
So, like, I was like a new hire that was sort of added to the tooling team to help sort of developers as a grand mission, and people that are developing blockchain technology, specifically on the Ethereum stack, be that ETC or Ethereum, make dApps easier, and to help them build actual like decentralized infrastructure. And so that's kind of where things are at now and what I'm doing currently.
Okay. Now, I before we get in, and I do want to hear about the details of working for ETC Labs and what you're doing there. But before we get that, I was curious about something you said. So, in your time in fintech, you were, I think you said you did spend some time as an analyst, analyzing.
No, no, not as an analyst. I'm
Oh,
just building returns analysis software.
okay, okay. And then the CF that what was the CF?
CFA.
What and that what was that to analyze companies?
Yeah, and so that was just sort of independent and like partially sponsored by the company I was working for.
Okay, here's what I was getting at. So with your experience in fintech, I was wondering if you like, did you use that knowledge to kind of analyze different blockchain initiatives, and then you could say, yeah, I have a pretty good sense this one's going to take off. I should invest in this one, and you know what I'm saying? To make could you use that to make yourself a good amount of money by knowing which ones have a good chance of taking off?
Well,
Yeah.
it's funny that you should say that. So you would suspect that you would be able to do that, but the CFA is more, I guess there's two sort of schools of thought, or two main schools of thoughts, at least in my mind, about investment. So one of those is sort of doing fundamental analysis. So it's like, oh, what are the book to, like, what are your book value? What's your, like, ratio between
Right.
like
Earnings per share. Yeah.
earnings per share and things like that. And then doing these sort of regression analysis models where you're like predicting growth and like discounting at like the rate of return. And so like that all makes sense when the fundamentals actually exist. But the other sort of school of thought is technical analysis, where you're looking at volumes and what the market is actually doing on a day to day, and trying to predict trends on like how assets are moving in the market and what the price is and what the spread is, which is something more akin to the way that you would like evaluate trading, because like you're looking at this sort of really short term analysis. But doing that is like, if you could do that well, then of course you would win the game and you'd collect lots of money.
Right.
So like the CFA material, it helps when you're doing like evaluations of startups in general. But for a lot of blockchain projects, there aren't really good models of like what
Interesting.
success looks like.
Okay, so
For
it's
those,
so new. Yeah. Not because blockchain
it's
startups are so
speculative.
new. What's that?
Yeah, it's because things are so new. It's very speculative. And if you look at like sort of, let's say, a product that achieves what would be considered a blockchain success, I think in my mind, like crypto cities, like crypto kitties,
Right. Right.
that's still nowhere near the order of magnitude of users for any other sort of just Web 2.0 like startup.
Like compare the success of CryptoKitties to whatever that Pokemon mobile
Yeah,
app was.
Pokemon Go, for
Right, it
instance.
was just a ridiculous number of users all over the world. Yeah.
Right. And then you also have to think that the network can't scale that that way yet. So there's still a lot of infrastructure and technology to be built in order to support even reaching that level of market capture. So I think a lot of startups that have concrete valuations or things that are easier to evaluate, or companies that are moving into spaces that are more concrete. So like whether that be like pharmaceuticals, like supply chain tracking, because like they're already improving existing business. And so and they're able to be on these sort of consortium networks, which will allow them to like sort of scale and manage these networks a little bit better. So like those are a little bit easier to tie to valuation, and everything else is more like from my perspective is trust in the team and the technology and what they're actually like building. So evaluating the white paper and what the technology could be used for is like probably the place that I would say I start the most. Is like, oh, okay,
Right.
like
And yeah,
this particular project seems promising because X, Y, or Z.
right. Yeah. All right. So tell us tell us about ETC Labs. And well, we don't work there every day. Kind of, why don't you tell us? Pretend like we don't know anything. Tell us the structure, how many people work there. Yeah, give us all the details.
I will give you as many details as I can. So I haven't
Okay.
been there for too long, but it's my understanding that ETC Labs kind of functions as part incubator for DFG and investments. And so basically, for technology companies that are looking to utilize the ETC network, the company makes investments in these sort of startups to try and like give them like that first seed round, and like help them like build the actual product, whether that is like interfacing with someone like myself or the rest of the team to help them sort of work through or troubleshoot some problems, and basically help facilitate connections and communications between them and like the rest of the ETC community, the startup community at large, and things of that nature. And then the ETC sort of core dev group is focused on building tools and technology that can be said to push the Ethereum ecosystem across chains, be that ETC and Ethereum, forward. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and the core dev team goes to what you were saying, that the infrastructure still needs a lot of work because we can't necessarily support an app like the Pokemon mobile app.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it's not easy to sort of build these things. And so the way that like I look at it, and I think a lot of the team does as well, is we need to build a system where a developer can interface with someone that has a great idea or a sort of more business leaning and say like, oh, we wanted to do something that's like blockchain related. Does this make sense? Where the use case makes sense and lines up, but there's a clear sort of path as to how they can sanely structure this while maintaining the principles of decentralization. So that means not taking away the points where going through centralized infrastructure is like a necessary thing.
Mm-hmm. So
And
make it easy for people to not make it easy for people to choose ETC technology over other centralized solutions for their business case.
yep, yeah, for their business case or for their video game. It's not just for that kind of things, like B2B apps, but also like sort of consumer facing apps as well.
And so, would you say I assume it's with the concern that the tools for a business-minded entrepreneur are not quite as good as they could be?
Well, I guess when you're going through dapp development as the developer, right? You kind of have this responsibility. At one point, I was actually freelancing and I was consulting with a small steel company, and so there are a lot of business concerns that like flow through, and you sort of have to take in all of these concerns and then say, okay, how am I going to architect a system that's easy to maintain, uh, handles the business use case, and is like scalable? And so when you try and do that same sort of thing from the blockchain perspective, there is a lot of sort of misinformation and the tools don't quite work exactly the way you need them to. Or there's a lot of like jumping through hoops to try and make all the pieces work. And so you spend a lot of time discovering how this is going to work and that's going to work. But it's not really as easy as you would say build a REST service. And so if we can bridge that gap between building like between the tooling for building a RESTful service to building a decentralized dapp,
Right.
then like, that would be like great. You
And
know,
so it's
developers were less inclined to say no.
okay. Right. Okay. And so that's one of your missions then at ETC Labs. Is that one of the things you're doing is to improve? Or why don't you tell us? So then what specifically are you doing then at ETC Labs? You've kind of touched on it a little bit already. But.
Okay, so specifically, what I'm doing is I work for the tooling team, and right now I'm working on sort of one aspect of this calling Jade or Jade Suite, um, which is a collection of tools that developers can use to build decentralized applications. And so the project that I'm like currently heavily invested in and like doing a lot of dev work for is called the Jade Service Runner.
Okay.
Okay. And so what the Jade Service Runner is that it is basically a decentralized services runner. And so by that, it's this idea that as a dapp developer, you're writing your application, and a lot of times, due to like sort of time constraints and like an inability to know what your user knows or has, you end up relying on tools such as MetaMask, which is great, by the way, to allow the individual user that you're developing the dapp for to uh, connect to the network.
Okay.
And so this is like good from sort of an onboarding perspective, but it's not good for the network as a whole, because if people are relying on this like sort of centralized infrastructure, because underneath the hood, MetaMask by default will point to Infura,
Okay.
then you sort of have the same central point where all of the traffic is going to. The network is not improving its ability to validate blocks on the network, and you're like not fostering decentralization. So as the network scales and you want to do sharding, et cetera, and all these other things, you actually need people to run nodes. So what are some?
Oh, okay. So what if I understand you correctly? One of the things you're saying, another way you could say it is, if everybody runs light clients instead of full clients, that's a problem, and you want
Yeah.
people to run full clients. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So the question is like, okay, is there a tool that we can build that makes running decentralized services easy for both parties involved? So you kind of have this two pronged like problem where developer wants to connect to the user's like local full node. Developer doesn't know how that local full node is configured. It doesn't know if it's compatible with their dapp. So it doesn't know like what RPC port it has, what transport it's using. And that's just basically how that full node is exposed to the internet and like sort of what kind of requests it can make. And it doesn't even know if the full node is running, right? And
Right.
so if you think about like the state diagram that you would have going from uh, like asking the user about, is your full node running? Is it configured? Does it match this configuration? Is it still running? That's a lot of cognitive load for the user to handle.
Okay. Right.
So what the Jade Service Runner does is it reduces that cognitive load for the user, where our target is to have sort of a menu bar app where the Jade Service Runner will launch and then allow you to, as a developer, request that the user install the full node, run it, and the Jade Service Runner will like sort of manage this full node process and provide the developer with all the information that they need to connect to it without having to ask the user for that additional information. And the way that we're building this technology is such that we can start to apply permissions to that as well. So let's say that you want your dapp to not be able to access ETH balance for some reason on your full node. You could restrict that access, or you don't want it to access personal account. You could do that as well. So that's just like some of the benefit behind us sort of running the service for the user and then providing that link back for the developer. And sort of like the foundation of this and what this is built on is some of the awesome tooling that the team as a whole is building around the OpenRPC JSON RPC specification. So what that is just on top of JSON RPC, we've added an additional extension to it called .discover, which would allow any service to request an RPC description from a running service. So you would say RPC.discover, and it gives you back this OpenRPC document, which is just an RPC spec that describes all the methods, etc. And so recently, this was merged into an EIP for the Ethereum project, and we also have an ECIP for it. for the OpenRPC spec. And so this builds on this broader idea that we need to build a platform for developers to be able to run decentralized services. So if we take this one step further and say, okay, we're good at running full nodes that run JSON RPC, can we run other things and other services? And so the idea is that developers may be able to build small scale APIs that run JSON RPC and have an easy way to get users to run those services so they can stop relying on centralized infrastructure to host APIs. So that's just like sort of more along the longer term vision where you could potentially have a peer-to-peer network of these service runners that host services that users could connect to. And it's an easy way to sort of distribute your app and have that, or distribute your API for your app.
Wow. Okay.
Services. So that's head explode and maybe too much.
No. Okay, I'm trying to process it. Okay, so in my world, we have light clients, full clients that have JSON RPC interfaces. So you're talking about adding different nodes, adding additional services, but not every node on the network might necessarily have all of those, support all of those. But that would be a good thing because it would be better to start adding these to ETC nodes rather than having people go off and use centralized solutions. Did I say that correctly?
Almost. So I think there's maybe a couple confusing parts. So I think I'm going to cut off the head exploding part. And I'm going to keep more focus on, like, say, the ETC technology side of that.
Okay.
And so basically we have multi-geth and we have the classic geth implementations that support OpenRPC. And we also have geth, which is going to support OpenRPC for service discovery. And we have these clients that are all running RPC, JSON RPC, regardless.
Right.
Service Runner just works with JSON RPC services. OpenRPC is a part of that where you can get additional benefit, but it's not required for the service.
Okay.
And so what the Service Runner does at its core is manage these processes and will allow you to switch between environments and things like that, and make it really easy for the developer to either connect to the user's local infrastructure or to connect to another service runner. So they could run their own service runner somewhere else, or potentially in the future connect to a peer-to-peer network and discover peers that are running the service.
Okay, so this is a way to set up additional peer-to-peer infrastructure that's separate from the ETC network but supports it. Is that correct?
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah.
Okay,
because,
so then
you could either run the ETC services, but you always need a way to connect to a full node somewhere. Running a full node is difficult, and so in order to make that easier on the user, we're making it into a button press. You hit the button, and then the dapp developer has all the tools they need to request access and for the users to accept that request for access. And then users have to think about how the software is running.
Are you familiar with IPFS, Interplanetary File System?
Yeah, actually, I am. I have written some contributions to that in the past.
Because when I think about additional services beyond ETC and ETH, that's to me is the canonical supporting service that's in parallel that people might want to use, right? Because ETC blockchains aren't really great at massive file storage, so they rely on a decentralized storage solution, or that would be nice if they did. And so you're talking about supporting other decentralized services, kind of like what IPFS is already doing.
Yes, kind of like that. And like there are some like there's a little bit of a friction point there at the moment where underneath the hood, IPFS does not run with JSON RPC. They run with their own sort of custom RPC in between. But I don't see that as necessarily problematic. It's pretty simple to like sort of write an interface that exposes the parts of IPFS that are needed. And like we found an issue, but we just haven't had the time to really follow up. But that is exactly what we're looking to do, which is to sort of have this easy way to like rely on people like running their nodes. I mean, you need peers. And so this is like that sort of slice to try and allow people to become peers in this network. That's less involved than like it currently is.
Okay, make it easier for people to support all these different services. Okay.
Yep. And easy on developers to like know that these services exist, to discover them.
Right. Now, I'm curious how ETC Labs, like how came up with the idea of working on this? We were previously talking about analyzing potentially successful blockchain businesses. Like, did people come to you and say, here's our problems? Can you find a solution, or how do these ideas come? Where do they come from? Who's deciding this stuff?
So, from my understanding, like a few years ago, Shane Jonas and Zach Belford and the rest of the ETC sort of dev core, the team formerly known as ETC Core Dev, was working on this project called Emerald, where they were trying to build a tool suite to do what the Jade tool suite is targeting to do like now.
Okay.
And so sort of during this process, they stumbled across this tension point of understanding what the interfaces were for the JSON RPC based clients for Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. So the solution that they sort of thought of was looking at, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this technology called Swagger.
No, I'm not. No, but you go ahead and explain it for the listeners. Yeah.
So, like, basically, what Swagger is easy sort of documentation for REST services. So you specify how the REST service should behave.
Oh, wait. Let me stop you there. So for the people that don't know that are listening, go ahead and define what REST services are too.
Okay. So REST services are basically the way that you make requests across the internet. So when you go to www.duckduckgo.com, that is actually making an HTTP request to a web page, and it's using this thing called REST underneath that to make that request. And so when people are talking about RESTful services, they're talking about sort of the underlying technology that you would use
on the web. Oh, so
on the web.
Yeah, get and post.
Get and post.
Okay, gotcha. All right. So, anyways, getting back to what you were saying.
Okay, so thank you for that clarification, because you want to be as clear as you can be.
Right. No, you're doing great.
Okay, so you have this thing. You have the this Open API document specification. So basically, a format called JSON, which is close to a human readable format. So there's like machine readable, which is like no human can parse. And there's human readable, where it's like easy to understand. So if you can imagine kind of writing like almost a Word doc kind of thing that describes how the website should behave. Okay. And so what Swagger does is it allows people to specify how the website should behave and you can run this specification, which is called OpenAPI, with Swagger, and it will produce for you basically a website that allows you to click on various buttons and see the responses that you would expect to get from the service. And so basically, it'll also allow you to generate some code for this.
Okay, so it's a very high-level language to quickly create websites.
To document websites and website behavior. So generally, if you were going to write an API for a business or something like that, and let's say you're an independent software firm, the business would want you to document how this underlying API for their company website actually works. And building this documentation by hand is incredibly painful. And you run into this problem where the documentation can be out of sync with the code.
Right.
And so what you kind of want to do is try and couple the documentation with the code. So whenever the implementation changes, the documentation updates happen there in place as well. And so when you combine these two things together, it means that whatever you need to tell someone what the API does or what the website is doing or how it behaves, it's all documented and it's easy to read, and a person can just kind of click through and figure out how to use it. And so OpenRPC was this realization like that there's nothing similar or even close to it for JSON RPC services. And if you look at the technology that's sort of driving everything, even Bitcoin Node uses JSON RPC, parity client, etc. So there's no way to sort of couple these two together. So with the OpenRPC spec, and because it's JSON RPC and not OpenAPI, which is like REST, because REST is a little bit more complicated in its surface area, in the sense that there are lots of different combinations and situations that you can get into, whereas the JSON RPC specification is a little bit, I almost want to say more specific, in the sense that there are fewer states that you can find yourself in, so it's easier to generate code from than a REST API. So they said, okay, what's really needed here is that every time I go to look at what each client is implementing for its JSON RPC specification, I can't really figure out what is there and what is not, and what documentation reflects what. And so they realized that they could just make a specification for what should be there, and then automatically from that specification generate the code to make those requests, or generate the code to serve those requests. So no longer are you in this case where the documentation does not match the code. And so you could stay always in sync with the documentation and the code, which is a really powerful tool. And then you can also use this to then build tooling around. So one of the things that we have is this project called the Client Generator, which will take an OpenRPC spec and it will generate basically a Web3-like client that will allow you to connect to an Ethereum full node. And it's generated from a specific, from this specification. And so that kind of was the starting point for like this rethink of what the tools suite should be to really improve a dapp developers' life. And so what the team has been focused on is this idea of README development, where you're specifying, well, where you start from a spec and then you go through code. And so you're kind of defining what the behavior should be to then get to the implementation, which is a sort of more thought out way to like conceive of software. And because we're using this spec and this tooling, we're able to automatically generate these complex clients, and we know what the behavior is. Everything is what we would call typed. So it's just a little bit more informed as to what everything should be. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So it's impressive, and I'm thankful that we have people thinking so deeply about how to improve dapp development. I mean, that was certainly pretty impressive what you're working on, and it was also cool that you're borrowing things from the web space that are good ideas and kind of bringing what you can into the blockchain space, right?
Yeah. It's all about like trying to lower the cognitive load for the developer and then sort of feeding into this underlying pulse of code automation and like figuring out the particular slices that we can make in order to uh, really make it so that you're really typing out the behaviors of the application that you want to have perform. And as a developer, you don't find yourself in these situations where you're sort of repeating yourself uh, and doing a lot of other work to just have the documentation, to have the level of correctness that you would have or should have.
Right. So then you're going to be like a super dapp developer after all of your time working at ETC Labs, and so you'll be able to, right? You'll be state of the art when it comes to developing future dapps for clients, don't you think?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. It's been really interesting to sort of deep dive into these technologies and to see like how can we be useful and how can we make things that are good for the ecosystem at broad, and then like really get people developing dApps.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. All right. So why don't we kind of in the last section? Why don't we close by kind of talking about the future? So what are your thoughts, hopes for the future of ETC Labs and the future of dapp development? What could the state of the art be like in a couple of years? Kind of what are your thoughts looking ahead?
Okay, so I'm just gonna go for the moon. Well, not the moon shot, but like say 15 years out. 15
Okay.
years out is sufficiently far, but not like science fiction far.
Right. Right.
Like 15 years out, I would say it would be amazing to have a peer-to-peer network of decentralized services where anyone could be a host for a service, where developers are no longer deploying services to AWS, but they're pushing it to a peer-to-peer network, and people are opting in to serve that or not. Uh, where we have a nice shardable network.
Uh,
Maybe this is 5 years out.
okay.
And I would say where we're starting to see like real machine automation. I was talking with Shane on the team about this, and Shane and Zach, where there's this underlying current where the idea is we need better tools for developers to build software in general. And so, how do we build the correct automation things that would allow an AI to build part of the system for you? So, like, you can start to see this happening within IDEs and things like that, with auto like pulling in dependencies for developing. But what would it take for us to say, okay, machine learning, I would like you to build a weather app for it to go out, scan for a bunch of services that are available, find the source code, build it, figure out how to interface with it, how to use its client, and then to shell out or assemble most of the app. and where the human in the loop is doing mostly verification or tuning. And so like I think the future of code is not writing code probably, but having machines write code, which other people have talked about. And so like I've been nerding out about as well, like recently, which is the idea
Oh,
should be automation discovery, and maybe we can finally really actually have a semantic web of some sort. So
interesting. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
that's like pie in the sky weird.
Okay. Okay. So it sounds like you have, well, you have two of your big passions, or the things you think about. So you want the internet, the web, to be decentralized, to be able to replace the centralized web with decentralized technologies, and then also you want to automate as much as possible, make it as nice as possible to develop dapps, right, and services.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Very good. Very nice vision. All right. So I think we covered a lot of good stuff about your work at ETC Labs and dapp development in general. Did I forget anything, or is there anything else you want to add before we close?
Um, no, I think that was pretty much it. I would say let's just keep building.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Zane, for all you do and all that ETC Labs does, and for an interesting update. And I just wish you the best of luck on all your work there.
Oh, thanks, Christian. Thanks for asking and talking. This is
All
great.
right. All right. You're welcome. All right. Bye bye.
Right.